I'd like to introduce Dr. Froma Walsh. I have followed her career very closely throughout my career, and must say that truly she has been inspirational and someone to be admired. Dr. Walsh is the co-founder and co-director of the Chicago Center for Family Health, and also the Firestone Professor Emerita in the Crown School at the University of Chicago. Very impressively, Dr. Walsh has over 120 publications. So with that, just synopsis of her career, a shortened one at that, I'd like to present to you Dr. Froma Walsh.
Oh, thank you, Marlene. That was very generous. I want to also thank all of you who are interested in this topic this evening, because thinking about how to address, and if we address, loss issues in clinical practice, no matter what our discipline is, has always been problematic in our culture, because we live in a society where we're kind of averse to looking too much, too closely at death, and of minimizing loss and grief, so that often it's very hard for those who have experienced tragic losses to be supported in their couple and family life, and also by friends, and unless they have very vibrant communities. So it makes it more imperative for us as therapists to pay attention to the losses that are suffered, and to think about how we can best respond when they are in deep pain. Now, tonight we are focusing on loss and resilience in turbulent times. And I think that applies to all of us who are helping professionals, as well as the clients that will be coming to us, because we've all gone through this prolonged, arduous, and roller coaster ride on the pandemic. And we all have concerns in our society, from mass shootings, from police violence, from those who are suffering in disadvantaged communities. We worry about events around the world, the war in not only in Ukraine, but in other parts of the world. And now we have the earthquake in Turkey. So there are many things besides thinking about the future for our youth, for climate issues that are coming to the fore, so that it's a time of turmoil with economic concerns piled on, partly related to the pandemic, but also with the ripple effects of the war and other global concerns. So there's a lot that we have been going through. I will use we to mean all of us, but I hope that we can not just see this as work focused on grief, but also work focused on renewal, rejuvenation, and resilience. I've been working with both issues throughout my career. In the beginning with Monica McGoldrick, we began our long interest in the losses that people were bringing to us in our practice, sometimes hidden, sometimes in the distant past, sometimes appearing in couple conflict, sometimes in child symptoms, which is why we need to take a systemic perspective, which Ackerman Institute is renowned for. If we're going to be working with loss, we can't just be working with one member of the family who might be at the moment having most intense symptoms of distress. And the prevailing models for grief work are much more focused on reducing those symptoms, and may not be attending sufficiently to the relational networks that are important in our recovery and in our ability to thrive after loss. And it's also important in our work that we take account of and address those concerns in social context that are piling on and making loss issues more difficult. And that's why we're going to look tonight at multiple losses in the pandemic and the pileup of ripple influences in our lives. And we'll be shifting to look at how we can foster healing and resilience. In the second half of our talk tonight, we're going to focus on more complex and traumatic loss situations and some of the principles of practice that we bring as systemic therapists, whether we're working with individuals, couples, or families. So to begin, one of the best ways to live with and live through these tumultuous times is with a sense of humor. So let me begin our slideshow tonight with cartoons that I find helpful to me and nourishing. I was very much struck at how it was focused on individuals. And my whole work over the last 3+ decades has been in understanding how couples and families support resilience. So that will be an important focus of our talk tonight. Also, I began from my review of all of the research over that period of time, my own studies and my own clinical practice to identify key processes, transactional process, relational processes that we as therapists can foster, can facilitate in our practice with clients that come to us to support their healing and resilience. And tonight we're going to focus mostly on belief systems and the importance, really the power of meaning making, of hope, and of transformation. So let's begin. First of all, we have been living through this time of COVID and relationships, as you all know, have been kind of stuck or distant or having many complications. Let me just go forward here. I'm starting. All right. What we've found is in families, they're carrying enormous stress and burdens through this time. You know this in your own lives as well as your clients' lives. And we've tried to celebrate from a distance through this time. But over the 3 years, what we found was we moved from a crisis phase to just prolonged struggles and a roller coaster course. And I love this cartoon. The wife is sitting trying to distract herself from everything going on in the world around by reading a book. And her partner there is too much focused on the media. And many of us have found that trap. And she says to him, "You're really making this a lot worse." The last 3 years, I think the picture on the left kind of says a lot for those of us who were isolated in our homes, particularly the elderly and those who had underlying medical conditions, were at higher risk, and those who really had the privilege not to have to go to work in frontline jobs. But it seemed like time kind of became it melted in a way. It seemed like one day blurred into the next, the days and weeks blurred into the month, and we really lost track of time as it progressed. And what we are seeing is that there are ongoing and new anxieties that are preoccupying people. I love this, different kinds of anxieties, and you may feel this way, that you're carrying all of these in your lives, trying to move forward. So how do we foster resilience in this systemic practice approach? To grieve and adapt to losses and disruption, to navigate the challenges ahead, and to go forward to live and love fully. So what is resilience? Because we use that term, it's become just synonymous with strengths, and we hear it on the news every day, even in sports news. So it's really about coping and adaptation, plus the potential for positive growth out of that suffering and struggle. Some say that if you just manage to be competent and keep functioning all the way through, that's resilience. Most of us who have been working in this area and the science that has been emerging really sees it much more as processes over time. So we're going to dip, we're going to have times when we can manage it all, times when we just want to pull those covers over us. That doesn't mean we're not resilient, because it's about processes over time. And many people who really are suffering for quite a while forge resilience much later through learning and growing out of that struggle. So resilience looks different in different situations, and different clients are going to find different pathways in their resilience. But the important thing is, it's not simply strengths, but it's in what we do when bad things happen. It's the strengths in overcoming adversity. So that more than surviving, you know, some clients come and they're just barely holding on. It's regaining that ability to thrive. Sometimes becoming stronger, that you have to tap into strengths that you didn't know you had. You have to maybe build new muscles, new strengths, in order to be more resourceful. So resilience is not simply an outcome, but it's about these beliefs and strengths in practices that we can encourage when our clients come to us and they're struggling. So our lives have been upended. It's important today, particularly because many of the formats for clinical practice are emphasizing the brief manualized approaches, or they're solution focused, very much wanting to move forward because maybe you have just a short period of time. But it's important that we not jump too quickly over the losses, the disruptions, the suffering, because we need to attend to that, because it's not getting over it, it's helping our clients move forward through it. So first of all, it's important to understand the different losses that people are experiencing at that time. Our lives have been upended. There's a sense of normalcy that's been shattered. If you think about the pandemic, and you think about all the politics around it, and you think about the communications and the vaccines and the different positions and how things changed and evolved over time as we learned more, or as different viruses changed and varied, as different ways of being vaccinated were developed. But what it meant was, it was very hard to keep any sense of normalcy. It was hard for predictability, for safety, for trust. Who can you trust to tell you what's really happening and what's going to happen next? Who am I safe with or not safe with? Where can I go and be safe and not safe? You feel a loss of control over your lives, a loss of freedoms with the restrictions, and kind of unmoored. It's with life structures disrupted. So in one sense, there's this feeling of being kind of trapped and confined, and at the other sense, being unmoored with so much disruption, with a chaotic daily life, weeks and months, the uncertainties, the shifting guidelines, what can we expect? Just the sense of control in our lives. So I think when clients are coming to us, they have understandably very high anxiety and uncertainty. And it can be helpful to name all of these things because it's part of that experience of overwhelm. I love this cartoon. This couple is sitting there every day. Are you talking about the new normal of an hour ago, or is there a new normal now? Because we can't just go back to normal as it was. In the multiple losses of the pandemic, first of all, people have suffered complicated and traumatic death. There's the loss of loved ones and vital roles in the family. The losses are sudden. Sometimes they're ambiguous. There's extreme suffering when a loved one is suddenly ill. And particularly if they're hospitalized and they were on a ventilator for a period of time. And then for loved ones unable to be with someone towards dying, trying to hold on. And all the ways that traditional funeral rites, gatherings, burials were hampered, which interferes with mourning processes. And now we're dealing, as we are emerging from this pandemic, with those who have complications, the long COVID with serious chronic pain and suffering, COVID fog. So we're not entirely out of the woods on this. There are other losses that accompany the pandemic, particularly the physical contact with loved ones, elders, extended family and friends, the community involvement. We found ways to do this through our Zoom chats. But I think after a while, there was this yearning to be together in real time in one place. And for youth, the losses in learning and social development, we're still going to be dealing, families, parents are going to be dealing with the challenges, helping their youth as they've emerged from the pandemic and are kind of struggling to go forward in their lives. We're seeing very high rates of attempts and risks of suicide. We're seeing more drug experimentation, and then unfortunately deaths that are related to overdose. We're seeing more accidents out on the streets. Those are reported. There just seems to be this anxiety, this disruption that is coming out in all kinds of ways that can lead to more tragedy. I think too, with the isolation and the loneliness, there's been a lot of depression, particularly for elders, that made things worse for them, particularly in nursing homes, where there was also a higher risk of COVID. Insecurities have been not just during the pandemic, but continuing on with jobs and economic security being precarious, income, housing, and food, and now inflation. And the lower economic families have been hit the hardest, particularly families of color. Women and mothers have felt that crunch of jobs and childcare, homeschooling demands, and elder care. Safety and gun violence is really now a constant concern, as are mass shootings that continue to recur. The political, societal polarization is exhausting in the deadlock, and we worry about climate change and future hopes and dreams. So we're all in these storms, but we're not all in the same boat. Marlene Watson and her colleagues have written about this in a wonderful article that's on the reading list. The disparities in risk and impact for racial, social class, and gender disparities. Older adults and youth, for systemic and structural factors that affect not only serious illness and death with the lack of health care, job demands, financial insecurity and family stresses, and access to resources. So we need to attend to our clients who have the highest risk and may face the greatest challenges in recovering from not only the pandemic itself, but also from the economic concerns that accompanied it. And here we are, the therapists, the helpers, who are fortunate to be working at home, but also in the middle of our own mess of our lives. And I'm wondering how many of you, just to sit back for a minute, thinking about our own strains as health and mental health professionals. Which picture here would you say kind of fits how you've felt as we've emerged from this long ordeal? Some feel very empty. Some would just like to climb into that refrigerator, cool off, and just maybe sleep for a very long time. And I'm for the cafe mocha vodka Valium. I can stick the Valium, leave the Valium off, but the latte to go. So here we are looking ahead. The road ahead has a lot of uncertainty. I've used this slide on the left often in thinking about clients who come to us in our practice. Often they're going down the road of life and they come to us when there's a sudden break in that road. They don't know if they can go back. And with the pandemic, we're not sure how much we will recover from the past and how much we are going to have to reinvent our lives going forward. And our work with our clients is often helping them make that leap to the road forward. Only it's not just one road forward, because resilience can be found on many pathways. And so there's not a particular pathway that we can say, go this way and it's going to be a lot better for you, but they're going to have to figure that out. And our job is to accompany them as they kind of weigh their options, as we help them consider pathways ahead. And what we're going to see here on the right, though, is that what we experience every day is that there are lanes closed for spite, there are pathways not open, and even more, it's going to be a roller coaster course ahead. We can't see around the curve, and we just hope that on the lower left slide, we're not going to careen off the runway before we make it forward. So when we look at resilience, we have to think about what it means, really. And there are a lot of faulty views. In our culture, it's about the rugged individual, invulnerable, self-reliant. There's shame in showing weak feelings, needs, or depending on others. Actually, resilience, as research has shown, is not simply a set of traits. You're resilient or you're not. Yes, certain traits are helpful, but sometimes the most vulnerable people can tap into strengths and become more resilient. So it isn't just you got it or you don't. And so it isn't about typologies. And we have to be very careful when we hear maybe policies or public pronouncements of, well, they just weren't resilient or they would have made it through, because we don't do it alone. It's relational and it's contextual. And when people come to us, and in individual therapy particularly, we don't want to be the only one who is their lifeline to healing and moving forward. We want to help them connect or reconnect with those that can support their resilience in their everyday lives. The most important thing that's come out of all the research on resilience is that it's not just what you have before the tragedy strikes, but that you can grow out of it. And we can build it just like we learn skills we can maybe alter beliefs and learn new practices that facilitate that. What's unhelpful, though, is in our social context, there are a lot of messages that people get who are grieving to get over it, to put it behind you. There's this idea of instant closure, which is faulty. And my good colleague, Pauline Voss, has spoken very much about that mistaken idea that we find some closure and just move on. Also, this idea of detaching or cutting off from painful feelings. Just keep cheerful, this relentless cheer. And we have to avoid what people often hear from others, like God never gives you more than you can handle, or you're tough, you're going to make it, you're strong, which can disenfranchise people's need to attend to their pain. So this faulty view of resilience, just bounce back, is really not helpful. What is helpful is research that shows that recovery processes take time. Expect and validate the suffering, the struggle, and the setbacks. And it really then is about helping our clients to struggle well. That's what healing and resilience is about. Making meaning and learning from experience, reorienting hopes and dreams, and integrating adversity and resilient response into the chapters of life. It's important too, from our systemic view, that we're all in this together, and that when lives and bonds are disrupted, disorientation is common. What's helpful is to help our clients see that distress is normal. It's human in abnormal times. And that vulnerability also is human. It's part of our human condition. And that we need and depend on each other. So to build resilience in couples and families, I've spent now, as I've said, several decades working in this area. And we really need to think about those relational processes for coping, adapting, and positive growth. So we work with those relational processes, might be in crisis or trauma that people come to us around those disruptions, or around multi-stress persistent conditions, particularly in communities that have barriers to succeed and lack the resources that others are advantaged with. So we mobilize social and community and cultural and spiritual resources. These are assets that often are missing in individualized approaches. And we also attend to the changes that are needed in larger systems, structural changes that are necessary for families and their members to recover and thrive out of their adverse situation. So, from a systemic perspective, we see that a stress, a crisis, and a challenge affect all family members, their relationships, and couple and family units. Shock waves are going to reverberate throughout the network, and a cascade of stressors is going to compound that distress. But on the other side, the couple and family responses influence adaptation for all members, bonds, and their own unit. So how a couple pulls together when one may be bereaved at the death of a parent or of a child, how the couple pulls together may need our attention, because when the partner doesn't know how to be helpful or retreats into work or other demands. One is left alone and struggling. Coming to an individual therapist may be helpful, but then you go home to that partner who's unresponsive, and it puts their relationship more at risk. And we know that couples that have experienced major death and loss in the family are at higher risk for withdrawal and for divorce. But we also know that the studies are mixed, that couples that turn toward each other in mutual support and in teamwork through that situation come out on the other side stronger. And they often will say that somehow we would not want that tragedy ever again to happen in our lives. But somehow it brought us together. It was a wake-up call and made us realize how much our relationship matters. And through pulling together, we're a stronger couple than we were going into it. That's what resilience is about. We also pay attention to collective trauma, collective healing, and think about the community response. Often when there's a community tragedy, for instance, a shooting death. I live in Chicago. A lot of my work over the years has been in teaching and training with social workers and others out on the front lines in neighborhoods that have suffered too much violent death and loss. And in our own practice, helping families who are bereaved after the loss of a loved one. We need to think about both family and community response for shared efforts in recovery and resilience. So when we think about the family network, Monica McGoldrick has been phenomenal in helping us understand genograms and the importance of extended family relationships. When we're working in a crisis situation, I find it important to maybe just sketch out those that are most immediate, and not just those who are part of the problem, but from a resilience perspective, looking at those who can help, who might make a difference in making things better. So I'm looking for emotional and practical support, for inspiration, asking about stories of past adversity, and also about those who responded in resilient ways and what they might learn. Not only this person was great in what he or she did, what they did through that time, but rather, what were those processes? What were the bonds like? What did they do that made a difference that we might learn from, that you might incorporate? So it's really learning and growing with and from others in that network. So in my practice over time, we focus on these 3 domains of family functioning. These are just dimensions of family functioning. What's important are those 9 key processes that were identified and that research in different parts of the world now has really confirmed as being essential ingredients for families and for couples when they're going through adverse times. I want to just mention very briefly, because we have limited time tonight, what some of those processes are, and encourage you to readings where you can learn more. But first of all, thinking about those organizational resources. With the pandemic in particular, we needed flexibility for adaptive change. I mean, we had to every day be thinking about how to adjust and at the same time provide stability, particularly for children, for structure and reliability through disruption. So it took strong leadership and for couples really to pull together. Connectedness, I mentioned, for mutual support. the idea of teamwork, that particularly in single parent families, too often it's that parent is then given more responsibility to pull the whole family up and through it. When we need to think about teamwork, how members, whether there's another parent who is a non-residential, extended family, informal kin and community, that we have a helping network that works in teamwork for collaboration. We need to think about larger system supports. How is the workplace hindering? How might we maybe coach a client toward changes in the workplace that are going to be more compatible with family life? How do we maybe encourage their advocacy for childcare, for elder care, for better pay, for teachers? So as a systemic therapist, I'm working with my clients, but I'm also thinking about how I can help them maybe work and advocate for larger changes. Now, this comes out of the resilience experience in research and in my practice, where people say often, I got to a place where I knew I couldn't control what had happened to us in our lives, but I want something good to come out of this. I want to do something that's going to benefit others. And I listened to that. And if we listen to that, it's like a spark that we might want to encourage for them to find something that's meaningful for them. Maybe to honor a loved one who died. I've had that often happen with parents who lost a child to suicide or to drug overdose, that they can't go back. There's no way to bring that child back. And we work with their grief. And then they get to a place where I want to do something to honor my child, to remember the best in my child, to do something so that other families won't suffer what we have suffered through this. So I want to mention that because I think that's something I've learned in my practice about resilience, and that it's healing as people do reach out to others. Communication processes, that's just part of our work. Encouraging clear messages, open communication, which is going to often have to be not changed, but adapted as we learn more or messages change or confusion reigns. To share feelings with respect for differences. People are going to, in a family, each have their different way of responding. Some more behaviorally, some maybe in emotional distress, some in withdrawal. And we have to help couples and family members, both with respect for one another's ways and pace of recovering, to at the same time find ways to support each other. The other side of it that often gets missed is the positive feelings, the positive actions that express pride, appreciation in couple relations, in families. Moments of joy, of humor, for respite, to break that constant demand, that constant sense of overload, to refuel energies and spirits. And third, collaborative problem solving and proaction, to help our clients learn from their setbacks, things that don't work, things that they tried and now the situation has changed, to celebrate their successes and to be proactive, to plan, prepare. People have said to me, I don't just have plan B, I have C, D, E, and F through the past 3 years that we have been living through. And maybe I have to throw that one out and come up with a new one. So it's made us all more inventive. So in coping with these multi-stress demands, sometimes clients, because of our individualistic streak in our society, they say, I should be able to manage it all, tough it out. I don't want to depend on others or burden others. And that just leads to burnout. What's helpful is strength, finding strength in acknowledging distress, in struggle, and in having needs, that's human, it's normal, and that we can help to validate the humanity in that. Particularly, I find with men who are more attuned to or raised in more traditional masculine ideas. This, I can't show weakness. I need to be stoic. I need to be strong for everybody. We need to help them see the strength in showing vulnerability, in softness, and in supporting others. Also, to reach out to others for support. And again, well, I don't want to depend. They're having their own struggles right now too. Well, if we think about mutual interdependence, well, how might you sit down, bring your sister in for a session and talk about how you could do a mutual exchange where you can do something that relieves some stress for her and she can do likewise for you. Or you can pay it back later or pay it forward. So to shift from this idea of weakness and dependency to our essential interdependence. I mentioned the teamwork, to think about caregiving teams, work-study pods. I mean, again, the collaboration. And the importance in daily life of reestablishing rhythm, structure. My good colleague, Peter Frankel, who is a musician as well as an excellent therapist with couples, it is all about rhythm and regaining that rhythm in relationships and in everyday life. And finally, making time and space to decompress and finding self-care. So, how do we view our adverse situation in the future? It's all about our belief systems, making meaning of that experience, hope that we can get through this even when we're not optimistic, and the transcendent values and practices, particularly through spirituality, for solace, connection, inspiration, for transformation, for priorities, purpose, and goal, and compassionate action to benefit others. So these are really what I want us to think most about in this time that we have together. We can help our clients to normalize and contextualize their distress, to gain a sense of coherence, that the crisis that they're going through may be larger or beyond their control, but that we can help them to comprehend and manage it, and that this is something that's meaningful for them to address. To look at their situation and their path forward, and to kind of get out of issues of control and blame, any catastrophic fears that they have of the future, so that we can foster their sense of active agency. Now, positive outlook. This isn't about relentless cheer and false hopes, but what's helpful is acknowledging and listening with compassion, first of all, to their losses and hardships, that range of feelings that they have, and rekindle and reorient hope from despair. And what I think is most important in my work, I love this phrase, to practice the art of the possible. There are things beyond control, but encourage focus on what our clients can control. For me, during the pandemic, often it was just that I could have a rhythm through the day, that there'd be a particular time of day that I would move from one room to another, that I would have my piece of chocolate and maybe a special treat, or that I would go for a walk. And that structure kind of helped me to get through and gave me some sense of, I don't know what's happening and what's going to happen, but I can get through this day and the next one. It's about taking active initiative and persevering. accepting what is beyond control, and tolerating uncertainty. That last one is biggest for us now, because as we've emerged from that pandemic, we are facing all these other threats to the economy, to violence, to things that just feel polarized and stuck in our society. So how can we, through that uncertainty, through that stuckness, maintain a sense of hope? I think I want to go back to this reorienting hope, rekindling hope. My colleague Kata Weingarten talks about reasonable hope. It's realistic hope. And maybe things that we have hoped for, we have to grieve that they are not going to happen. With the loss of a job or a factory or a career, even a business closing, our aspirations for our careers may have to be re-envisioned. So it's about, without being, when we see that things are lost, that we can still reorient hope, that we don't yet know what the future is going to bring, but we're hopeful that we're going to find our pathway forward. Finally, this transcendence of values and practices through larger purpose and connection. Many find it through spiritual nourishment in their faith community, or in their personal faith, or in their secular beliefs, humanistic beliefs. Through contemplative practices, many find it through nature, art and music, and that it inspires us to envision new possibilities, life dreams. So being able to not be stuck in our particular situation, to be able to feel connected to larger values, a larger community, to a larger humanity, helps us to envision new possibilities, to find creative solutions. So it's about then learning and changing and positive growth that people are often surprised occurs through this process that really leads to a transformation. Reorienting life priorities, things that we thought were normal and that were normal in our daily lives, that daily commute, that we want to change, that we don't want to go back to normal. And that we really reappraise what matters and who matters in our lives. We deepen bonds, appreciate simple things, sharing a meal with friends and families in person. I don't think I've ever valued it as much as now that it's safe to do that in indoor spaces. Compassion and social action to benefit others that we've talked about. So when we've lost a loved one, what is important is finding ways to honor and sustain those connections. Ritual gatherings, streaming. We now have invented ways that those who are not able to be present can at least be attending and feel a part of these important gatherings. Through internet connections and remembrances on websites that get set up to remember a loved one who's deceased. Because one of the hardest things that families have faced through this is that they were isolated in their experience of grief. They maybe could not go and be with their loved one when they were dying. They couldn't attend those funeral and burial or cremation ceremonies. They feel alone and isolated. So finding ways, maybe through internet access and websites, sharing stories and photos with others at a distance. And the spiritual connections with our loved ones who have passed away, but we don't detach emotions from them, but rather we re-experience through spiritual connections, through deeds, through legacies, that we remember them into our future. I love this as a wonderful when a year ago and the year before on the Day of the Dead in Chicago, 25% of the city residents of Chicago actually are Latino. And so the Day of the Dead is quite big here in our city. And this was one celebration that was in our local news about a young woman who was celebrating with loved ones memory of her grandparent, of an aunt and uncle that were very special to her, a cousin, all who died in the pandemic, many because they were on jobs where they were at higher risk for COVID, others who were in places where the risk was just too high. But through those celebrations coming together on the Day of the Dead, having that kind of communal gathering really can make a difference. Meditative practices, meaningful rituals at home, and in nature. For me, just seeing a new sprout coming out of the ground in the spring when nothing was changing in our lives, that gave me hope that there's something in nature that will bring new life. And human animal bonds, that's very deeply important to me. And I've written articles about the relational significance of human animal bonds. And during the pandemic, we found just a spike in adoptions of animals, pets, but they now are referred to as animal companions or companion animals. And those who adopt are not owners, but are pet parents. You know, we have to wonder who rescued who here. And we've had innovations in our therapy practice as we've gone to remote. It's been challenging, but also many of us have found that we are able to bring in family members who were not available or who did not have geographical access to come to sessions, so that it is actually more possible to work in couple and family sessions, whether you're working primarily with an individual or you're doing primarily conjoint therapy. So we do have these that we're still learning how to make the best of them. So resilience is about bouncing forward, not bouncing back. What matters and who matters. Okay. And last, I want to mention time, lost and found. It's been a time out. There's been time travel. We could say that even though we feel stuck in this time, I was urging during the pandemic in those calls to family members, particularly elders, rather than how was your day? You know, when the day really isn't holding very much of interest, revisiting the past, having children and adolescents interview their grandparents. How did their grandparents meet? You know, what did they love about each other? What was their life like? What adversity did they face? And how did they manage to survive? Because they did, and here we are. So there are many ways to think about time, even though we may feel stuck at the moment. Again, as I mentioned, thinking about our lives in the past. What do we want to conserve? What do we want to revise or reinvent? And finding ways to connect more deeply. And learning from adversity that this is time to heal old wounds. I think one lesson that came out in oftentimes in my practice where people said that this crisis made me realize I don't like to think about the fact that one day I'll die or I'm going to lose, you know, my husband or my partner or my, you know, my child or my parent. But now I realize that it can happen at any time. And I realize I want to make a difference while there's still time. I want to heal those wounds. So we may find that a crisis, or in bereavement, I didn't know that someone young could die. I didn't know my transgender youth could be lost to me. He was struggling. They were struggling. She was struggling. We didn't know there was so much going on, and they just tried a pill, and there was fentanyl in it. They're dead. How can this happen? My child was so promising of the future, and now we've had to bury them, and we've had to grieve. So I think what I've heard many times is we want to not take relationships and other relationships for granted. We want to make a difference in them while there's still time. I know in several families, they talk about going out. They're going to now get involved, whether it's in stopping drug trafficking, whether it's in coalescing in community and larger networks to change the laws, to get rid of assault weapons, to gun safety that is required, that sometimes tragedy impels people to take action that they might not have before. So this can be an opportunity that people can seize to make a difference. So it's precious time, and make the most of it. What I'd like to do at this moment is think back to that dog where it said pause, and take a pause. We have another half hour together. Some of you may want to just stand up and take a deep breath.
Excuse me, just for a minute. Looks like we have a question.
Okay.
Or a comment. Thank you. I love the bouncing forward and resilience. Such a wonderful presentation. So there you go.
That's good. That's good. Thank you. Just before the pandemic began, I was very distressed by the developments in grief work in our country and internationally now, where there is now a new diagnosis in the DSM and also in the international diagnostic scheme for prolonged grief disorder that is entirely deficit-based and individually focused, and is linked to manualized brief therapy with an individual to reduce symptoms. And I, as a systemic therapist, as a couple and family therapist, I thought back over really 4 decades of work in our field of attention to loss that went back to Murray Bowen, that went back to founding people in our field, that noticed that ripple effect through relational networks when there is a tragic loss, that it affects every member, it affects everyone in the family. So Monica McGoldrick and I were noticing that in our own clinical work, and we started writing about it a very long time ago. And we then held a conference in Ireland in 78 with our colleagues internationally in systemic work who were also working with loss and wanted to explore it together. And that led to our edited book, Living Beyond Loss, Death in the Family, and the second edition, which was in 2004. So a lot of this work was done very early in our field, and I've continued to specialize in this area. I taught a course at the University of Chicago, multidisciplinary course that was called Loss, Recovery, and Resilience. I taught that course for many years, really bringing this expanded perspective to working with loss and also working with the revitalization for resilience. So it was very troubling then to see that now we're kind of back to square one, or maybe it's partly our individualistic society. And also the problem that research money is often tied up to problems and risks and symptoms in individuals. And so it's very difficult. There just has not been attention and money in research to continue over time with this broader systemic view. So I decided we needed another book. And so at first I thought, do I want to do an edited book? No, I'll just do it myself because this is what I care about. And because we each have a calling as therapists, I think. Something brought us into this field, often from our own life experience, our own family legacies. And in my family, that legacy was very tragic deaths and losses, often that were secret, that were either too unbearable, that were unmentionable in the family, that just went underground, and that I only learned later in my own family of origin work, but that still I found myself drawn to work with clients who were bereaved and to be thinking about those ripple effects in relationships. So once the pandemic started, I thought, oh, I don't know how I can do this. This is just all too much. It's overwhelming. And fortunately, my editor said, just take a pause. I like this, take a pause. That's part of resilience. Take a pause. And I did for a couple of months. And I thought, I can't. What do I have to say? What we're living through right now is too massive. And then I picked myself up and I thought, okay, I'll just start at the beginning and I'll work my way through. And I guess that's what we do when we write. And so I'm pleased that the book is finished. It's just in production now and will be out this summer. So I'm sorry, I didn't mean to go on about that, but it matters. And I'm afraid that we're in a culture that is contributing to disenfranchised grief because people are uncomfortable with it. They don't know what to say. They don't know what to do to be helpful. So they say nothing and they distance. And too much of it is going underground. So it's not just that there's intense grief where people come for grief work, whether it's for 6 sessions or 8 or 10. But I worry as also for those where it goes underground, where they suppress it. Sometimes because, for instance, with this pandemic, they just had too much to deal with. They had to stuff it. And it never came back up again until later, sometimes long after the pandemic. So people may come to us long after a tragic death, still struggling, or they'll come in, and this is what Monica and I noticed and wrote about early in our practice. They'll come in with other issues, a relationship problem, conflict or divorce, or a problem child. Or they'll come in with repeated failings in their aspirations in life, getting fired by their bosses with the same conflict over and over. And when we do an assessment that includes looking at past experiences of loss, we often find that they're connected and that we need to pay attention to that. Let me just give you one example before I go forward here, because I think it just makes it so clear. At our center Chicago Center for Family Health. John Rowland and I have co-directed for a little over 30 years now. I don't know how, with a wonderful faculty that has been just a wonderful network of colleagues. We once had a couple with, we had the training with the mirrors or the one-way screen with the trainees behind the screen. And we had a wonderful experience where Gianfranco Cecchine, very wonderful colleague, a dear colleague, was visiting our region and came and spent the day with us and did a wonderful workshop. And so he happened to sit in and he met with this couple and they were talking about a conflict that they were having because she wanted to have a second child and her spouse did not. And he was adamant about it. And they had been fighting about it for some time before they came in. And so in the next session, the therapist went in and was pursuing, the meaning in their lives and the future, how it was going to impact their future and their financial situation. And I glanced down and we had done just a small genogram earlier. And I looked down and I saw that the husband's mother had died in childbirth with his younger sibling. And we knocked on the mirror and the therapist came in and said, would you ask about that? Well, he said, yeah, he said, it's the worst thing that ever happened to me, but I just suppressed it. And no, I never have told my wife about it. And I'm terrified. It's not about the child. I'm terrified of losing her. So that death that he had experienced of the death of his mother as a small child reemerged when they were about to have the second child. He was the older sibling. And it wasn't about having the second child. It was about losing his beloved wife. So sometimes there is a connection that is underground that's very important for us to look at as we're working with a couple or working with a family. So let me just do a very quick highlighting of some of the principles when we're working with very complex loss. First of all, grief. I think we sometimes have a simplistic idea, but it's really a whole complex of emotions and reactions that people have. And what the research has shown is that their different reactions can be normal. There is no right way to grieve, but it can matter if you're in a relationship and your way of handling grief is out of sync, or in a family where, as we said earlier, different members are reacting so differently, or one is not reacting until much later and others are ready to move on. So in the mental health field, as I mentioned earlier, we've been pathology focused, notion of being traumatized, and I think that word gets overused. I prefer to use the term trauma for a catastrophic event or for a traumatic experience by those who have experienced an exceedingly unusual or painful death. So it can be traumatizing for some and not for others, more deeply wounding, but we shouldn't assume that with a catastrophic event that everyone is going to be traumatized by it. Okay, just wanted to be sure. And so our approach is more prevention oriented and collaborative, and it's facilitating both grief and positive adaptation. And I don't want to repeat here. But let me say, in different formats of working, besides individual, couple, and family sessions, which we might combine or invite a partner in for a few sessions in our individual work. Or we might bring siblings in together when there's been a death of a parent and there are issues for their parent in their partnership, as well as parenting their children who are suffering. So we might vary and combine those different modalities. We also find multifamily groups can be quite valuable. For instance, with families who have lost a loved one to suicide, and also forums in collective trauma and loss in communities that bring community members together. So what we've learned from research is that normal grief has many varied reactions and pathways, but also there's this but a misunderstanding from earlier studies by Elizabeth Kubler-Ross and her partner, David Kessler, that this idea of progressive stages that people will pass through in normal or healthy grief to get to the other side. And research just does not find that it's variant. And I think of it more like many facets of grief, that ball of grief that you saw. And some may only experience certain facets, or they may shift and come out at unexpected times. There's an ebb and flow over time, and it can be reactivated, particularly at a milestone or at an anniversary, at Mother's Day, a birthday. So when I'm in therapy, I'm always thinking about that next event that's going to come, how that might be especially hard, but how it could also be an opportunity for a gathering or some kind of way to remember and celebrate or honor the person that was lost. Also, this oscillation in focus that research has confirmed. You don't just go, people have come to me and said, a couple, I don't know why we're here. You can't bring back my child. And others who come and they say, I just can't focus on this. I've got too much. So that these grief work can be useful for some, but for many, there has to be an oscillation between their attention to their grief and to everything else going on in their life that they must manage, their adaptive challenges. And so in therapy, we are going to shift our focus. Grief and recovery processes take time. What's not healthy is this idea of quick closure or cutoff. The research shows, again, as I mentioned earlier, what really happens is a transformation from the physical presence of that loved one to continuing bonds through memories, through stories, through photos, through legacies that we pass on to others. I think of my mother every day. She died in 1969. She's never far from my mind, my thoughts, my feelings. And she often inspires me when I'm looking for what to do in a situation, what to tell my daughter when she's needing help. So we can look to that and think about ways to help our clients make that transformation from the very painful loss of physical presence, which can take a year if it's a beloved or a lifelong partner, or if it's a child, if it's someone who was irreplaceable in life. These are going to be long journeys or pathways, and we have to avoid that pull that they may sense from others to move too quickly to get over it. Also, it's about adaptation and not resolution. So I don't talk about resolving unresolved grief and resolving grief, because it never gets completely resolved. We know, and particularly through narrative practice, but we also know through human development over time that we gain new awareness, new information, new DNA. I am going to write about my experience with that next. And we have to revise or update or expand the way that we understood those losses in the past. And I think we've talked about the differences as well. I also want to say one other problem with this prolonged grief concept is that it assumes that if it's longer than 1 year, that someone is intensely suffering or having emotional or functional symptoms, that they then get the DSM diagnosis. There are two problems, really. One is this cutoff, that why is that a particular time? Cultural, family, individual differences. Some it may be much longer, but also they also have only 6 months as that demarcation for children and youth to get over it, or it's called prolonged grief. Now, not only is that the diagnosis, but it's then in their record as a DSM mental illness diagnosis, which goes on their health record and which is pathologizing of normal grief processes that are going to be variable and may be more intense or may be more persistent or may come up later because of the circumstances of the loss in catastrophic events or in a COVID death. So we need to just not have some kind of a fixed notion of what's normal and what's abnormal. This idea, again, of working through loss and restoration orientation, we'll go back and forth. And again, when there is a milestone in the death of a child, when someone else is pregnant and having a child, that earlier pregnancy loss or the death of a child is going to be keenly felt. Someone will say, well, I thought I was over it. No, it's with you. You carry it with you for life. And it is going to recede and it's going to resurface as we move forward. We talked about that. Slide in there already. So to think about these losses as multifaceted as well in a family, the person and the loved one. Again, sometimes that grief work model is focused entirely on the dyadic relationship with the person who was lost, the person who died. And we're expanding it to also think about the meaning of those relationships throughout the family that were lost, the role, maybe it was a breadwinner in the family. It might have been a grandmother who was the primary caregiver for children. It might be in a sense that our family is always going to feel like there's a hole in the middle. It will never feel intact. Is my daughter an only child, or is she a child with a younger sibling who died? It changes who you are, how you think of yourself. And it might change in terms of work or livelihood when someone is lost, and financial arrangements, housing, relocation are all prompted by that death and loss. But most important, the hopes and dreams for the future are particularly shattered, especially with the death of a child. And also when it could be that there's a new relationship that starts in midlife or later life, the hopes and dreams there. Or for clients that I saw, their parents had worked very hard to save for retirement. They were working working class family. And finally, they had gotten a small retirement condo in Florida, and they were driving off to the sunset for their retirement. And a truck veered over on the freeway, hit them head on, and they were both killed. Now, you might think, well, the loss of an elder in a family, you're going to die when you reach later life. But this was such a tragedy for them. It was so unjust to lose a parent who was just on the brink of a retirement after working so hard, after saving so hard, that it was a very painful and difficult loss for the family. I've had parents come in, death of a stillborn child, a father who just pounds his fist on the table and says, "This is so unjust. I can't go back to our church. How could a loving God take the life of an innocent baby? I can't go back." And his wife is going to the pastor and her congregation almost daily for their support. They're at opposite ends of the sofa and of their home because he is furious that she would return to the church when he is having a spiritual crisis and can no longer. So sometimes we would have consultations with spiritual advisors, pastoral professionals, as we are working with the relational issues. And finally, the shattered assumptions that we talked about earlier. So we want to facilitate their adaptation to loss. This is going to be over time. We want to address the many different types or experiences of loss. And again, there are going to be commonalities that we can say it's common that people in your situation. And then there are unique features where it's the lived experience of that relationship, of the loss, and all it means to all the survivors. And so we need to take that time to understand with compassion what that loss means in their lives. There are many violent death situations, and we don't have time today to go through them all. Let me just quickly go past. I wanted to also mention, we are very proud. We have our daughter who works for International Medical Corps as a social worker who heads the global advising for all mental health and psychosocial support programs worldwide. And not only are they dealing right now with the war in Ukraine and supporting everyone who there is going through that, they're now dealing with the sudden earthquake in Turkey and the implications for everyone who is losing everything, loved ones, trying to rescue even a single life when they know that so many other lives will be lost. And for Syrian refugees and those who were displaced in northern Syria, who are struggling more after already going through the war and the atrocities that they experienced there. I want to say a word, therefore, for those of us who may be working in refugee services, working with asylum seekers, that most of the attention, understandably and rightly, goes toward adaptation and toward learning new language, skills, finding jobs and home and community involvement, helping children to adapt. But what we should not forget and neglect is the loved ones left behind, the communities left behind, and the losses that were suffered in their travel to get to refugee camps to get on to asylum, to arrive in resettlement. So often those losses are underground, partly because in our culture, we think about the nuclear family, and we may not be mindful, as we should, for immigrant families, for Black families, and for Latino families, Asian American families, and others who really are much more connected to their extended families. I think many of you may have had that wonderful experience with Celia Falikov in this lecture series last month. And we need to pay attention to the losses, and alongside the resilience that they have shown in struggling to get ahead, to survive, and to go on to try to thrive in their lives. I want to mention before we stop too that we are now experiencing another death, tragic death in police killings that was just horrific. And maybe I want to mention something that I wrote that we thought about at our center right after the death of George Floyd, that had to do with breath and spirituality in its broadest sense. That the word spirit is translated in many languages as breath. And if you think about it, the word spirit and breath, we are inspired. We breathe in the influences of those who inspire us. We aspire in our lives, breathing out those influences. And at death, we expire. That last breath that, for those who believe, releases the spirit. But at that time of the death of George Floyd, it made me think of how his death, his breath was taken away. He could not breathe. And how too many others have continued and are continuing to be denied their lives, their justice, their equality. That we, whatever our faith beliefs, that we all share a moral imperative. And as I wrote then, to find our breath, to find our voice, and our collective action for justice and equity. That's what we're dealing with right now. And we must act, and we must act together. So maybe this is a time to draw to a close. Let me just end with a few practice guidelines. More important than anything is bringing ourselves to be fully present with our clients who are facing death, who are bereaved by loss and are grieving. That we offer a safe haven for sharing intense feelings. That this is not a problem to solve. And that's hard for us. I was brought up to be a problem solver. I'm in a culture that encourages that. But we can't stop death, and we can't bring the deceased back to life. So we have to be careful that intervention about helping clients to think about a miracle. If a miracle were to occur, what would that be going forward? Well, if a miracle were to occur, it would be that my loved one would still be alive. And what we really need to do is spend some time and focus with compassion and help others in their lives do the same, and humanize, contextualize their grief and their distress. And I think this is the appreciative inquiry. We need to explore the many meanings and implications of the loss. So it is loss of that person and that relationship. What is hardest about that? What will be hardest going forward? what else? What are the meanings of those losses? And that is going to shift in so that meaning-making processes have really come to the fore in my work with loss. And there's a caution there. Our role is not to provide meaning. I don't interpret. If I notice that maybe there's a past loss that might be connected to the struggles they're having now, I have to be careful that I offer that as a possibility for them to consider. I am not making an interpretation in any kind of deterministic way. Aha, I found the source of your problem. We're systemic workers, and it's part of a larger whole that may have many meanings. Also, in our work to avoid assumptions and platitudes and homilies. I mentioned, for instance, you're strong, you're going to get through this. Or what some people tend to do, well, at least you have other children. At least you're young and you can repartner. Those are not helpful to people who are grieving, that we have to honor and validate each and every experience of loss that they are having without comparison with how it could have been worse. And be careful. People often, one author said, it seemed like everybody was telling me about someone in their lives who had had an experience just like mine, and it all worked out. And then I started hearing other stories as if this was all the same person and it always worked out for them. So we have to think about those voices that people are hearing, and that we are helping them to make it clear about what they need in their relationships with others. Okay, finally, I think I've mentioned all of this, but let me say at the end, the last chapter in my book, and I think I've spent the most time myself on, is getting to know our own families, our ancestors, and the losses that may have gone underground that affect our lives. And to look at that clinical interface. Harry Aponte is one of many, as Virginia Satir was, to think about the self, and I think the relational self that we bring to our practice. And if we are uncomfortable with loss issues, it could be because we grew up not knowing what to say or how to be helpful because it was never talked about. It may be in our professional training that we didn't receive training on how to work with it. It's up to those grief counselors. Or it may be in the legacies that came to us in our families. So we need to think about what we are bringing, because too often, particularly as people are facing the end of life, particularly in hospital settings, physicians, a study found that after they knew there was nothing more they could do to treat a patient, many physicians distanced. They were uncomfortable. They couldn't stop death. We have to be careful ourselves that we don't distance because of our own discomfort or because we don't know what to say or what to do. I hope that there will be much more training across disciplines in how to work compassionately with complex loss. So I guess that final word there is that this interface, it can either constrain us or it can enrich our work and our lives. When we come to understand losses in our lives and gain more comfort, it can enrich our work. Last and not least is vicarious resilience. The work that was done by my colleague Pilar Hernandez and her colleagues, vicarious resilience, what they found in their studies was that when therapists started listening for and asking about their clients' ways of surviving and overcoming terrible tragic events in their lives, those who were soldiers at war in Colombia, for instance, that they themselves benefited by the resilience that emerged, that came out in the stories and that emerged in their work, and they brought that into their own lives. But we have to be careful ourselves in this work, particularly those who are working maybe in oncology, or maybe where the losses are, for instance, around suicide, that we need to practice ways to nourish our resilience, to revitalize mind, body, and spirit with our family, friends, and communities, respite, self-care, and to find humor. It's not all good, but maybe I can laugh about it, and that gets me through the day. And to think about our own learning and what we can gain, to make the most of precious time. Don't postpone and have later regret. Reorder our priorities to live and love fully. Master the art of the possible, and I love this phrase, do all you can with what you have, in the time you have, and the place you are. So to end, let's end here. Life paths close to you. Your life today for the future. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Froma. This is so timely, because we all are living with a lot of uncertainty, a lot of loss, a lot of grief. And as therapists, we really do need to examine ourselves and be prepared to work with people. And it's so important what you said in terms of the things that are not helpful, because we recite religious quotes sometimes, and they are not always helpful. And it may be hard for people, to think of it as not being helpful, but not. So we have a few questions, and I'm going to read those to you. We have someone who is asking what it might look like, to stay connected with someone that you had a toxic relationship with.
I guess the word would be, I'm not sure about the stay connected. I think if we're talking about helping someone, should they keep connected or not be connected? I think it's a false dichotomy. Systemic thinkers, we're masters of the both and. Maybe we like to have things both ways, but we're always trying to think about how do we reconnect, but not in a harmful way. Is it possible to reconnect? So those are dilemmas. It's a dilemma that I would take on as, let's talk about that. What would need to change for it not to be harmful to you? What would need to happen for the harm that occurred in the past to not continue to hurt you? What would it take for the other person to do, or for you to do? So to me, it's a wonderful question, because it's the beginning of therapy. It's the beginning of sometimes our clients will come to us with that question. It's like in a marriage, should I stay or should I go? It's not my job to tell them what they should do. Should you stay connected? Not if there's continuing risk of hurt and harm. But let's talk about it. Let's see, is there a way to have a different connection, or maybe not? So we don't know. I don't know, and I don't have the answers, but I will explore and support their journey of figuring it out. what is going to be best for them. Some people are able to reconcile. Sometimes the other person is open. Sometimes there's that work that's done to not continually feel the hurt because of what was done in the past. That's what we do.
Okay. And someone else is asking about recommendations to help a client who's dealing with the death of an abuser.
That's a complex, very complicated loss. And it's good that they're there for you to help them with that. So for me, it's about needing to go back to understand that whole relationship and the context of that relationship over time as we come back to the death and the loss, because it's all part of it. And sometimes people have come to me after a death of someone who harmed or hurt them badly. And they say, I wish I could have reconciled before, because and the person dies, but the relationship hurt doesn't. And so they're coming in the aftermath. So part of the work is going back, as Monica would say, we're going to expand it, and we might involve others in that healing journey to come to a better place of meaning, of emotion, and of peace of mind, so that it isn't about acceptance or rejection. It is coming to a place of peace of mind to move forward.
Okay, thank you. And this other question asks for any advice you may have on straddling the line between holding hope for the future while also acknowledging the systemic racism and realism of life circumstances.
Yeah. Yes. Can I quote Cornel West?
Absolutely.
This is an old quote. A long time ago, he said, we shouldn't confuse hope with optimism. That we may be pessimistic. We may not be optimistic about chances for change, but we should never give up hope. And there's a philosopher that once said, hope is oxygen for the spirit. That without hope, we sink into despair. Harriet Ponte said that too. Without hope, we sink into despair, and it robs us of agency to live our lives. We may be surviving from day to day, but we're not thriving. So hope fuels a sense of agency that we're going to move forward. We're going to do what we can do in the time we have in the place we are, because that can make a difference. My daughter called me today. I mentioned she does humanitarian work, and she's lucky now. She's now in a management position, so she can live in Brooklyn. But she works remotely and is working with people all over the world. As it happens, this tragedy in southern Turkey and the northern part of Syria was exactly where she lived and worked for 2 years during the Syrian war. She was working with building capacities for local counselors to help those who were displaced and those who were refugees across the border. And now Antakya and Hatay was one of the worst where she lived and worked. And she was calling former colleagues and people who are still working in humanitarian work. How are you? And she called today, and one close colleague, a Syrian young woman who assisted and became employed as a counselor and working with families and worked on the Turkish side in Antakya. She and her family were in the earthquake, and they were only rescued after 38 days. And it was longer before the hours later till they found her brother. But others were not. So others did not survive. And she said, one can survive and another can't. And it's so hard, and we want to help. And in her field, it's like, you got to help those you can, knowing that many others can't. And those white helmets, the rescuers that are going in there, they know there are thousands of people under the rubble, and maybe they can find one precious life to save, and that is worth it. And I think that's what we do as counselors, as clinicians. We're working, one by one or family by family, trying to make a difference in their lives when we know that there are many more out there that are suffering. But I see it as my responsibility, and I hope others do too, that I'm also doing something outside of that work that we can do to maybe make a difference in our communities, that maybe I have a voice, maybe I can write an op-ed, maybe I could get on the news, maybe I could encourage people to mobilize, that not only am I working with the clients in my room, but maybe there's more that I can do outside that brings about those larger systemic changes. And I guess what's at the bottom of that is that well of hope, that we need that to fuel our efforts.
Thank you. And this question is, how would you help a family to move past the medical issues of a loved one that has caused the death and is experiencing grief?
I'm not sure that I understand the issues that caused the
Yeah, I'm assuming based on the way it is written that they're talking about the family. Let's say it's cancer that the person passed away from, and that they are just so focused on cancer and not able to move past that. That's my assumption.
Yeah, I think, and I'm thinking of other examples that are more painful for families. For instance, someone who is using drugs and dies of an overdose, and they suffer in two ways beyond the grief. One is, we tried to get them help, we tried to get them to stop, but we couldn't. Or someone who takes their own life, and there's that anguish that, what could we have done that made a difference, but maybe also that anger at them. Someone who goes out and drives recklessly and kills another person or ends up dead themselves. The anger at someone who acted irresponsibly. I think with COVID, we've seen that, and sometimes with, they weren't vaccinated. Or the thing of, well, they brought it on themselves. And it's toxic psychologically to continue ruminating and carrying those feelings. And so we can hopefully help them with how can we understand those feelings? They're natural in that situation to feel that way. He never took care of himself, and that's why he died. He drank too much. And so there's that anger. And maybe it's and the child who says, if he loved me more, if he had loved me enough, he wouldn't have taken his life. Mm-hmm. So I think that's one of the facets of grief, is anger at the person who died. It shouldn't have happened. And we look to make meaning of it, to understand the cause. Was it an accident? Was it negligence? They didn't notice their toddler walked out the back door of their rental condo and drowned in the swimming pool because they were busy with something. They fight because they're each blaming each other. It's all part of the facets of loss at the terrible, tragic death. Could something have made a difference? Could we have made a difference? Could they have made a difference? And I guess that's the normal part of helping them. The other part is when there is a tragic death with either an accident where there's a question of negligence, or where there is death by suicide or an overdose. People loved ones and families face a lot of accusations, silent or spoken, whispered suspicions of it was their fault, they didn't do enough, or, of what was the real cause of this. So those can be vicious, and they can also cause pain for the bereaved. And those are some of the complications that come up with very violent and traumatic deaths, situations of death.
Okay, thank you. Before I give you the next question, this recording will be on Acumen's YouTube channel. It will be up in about 2 weeks. We will inform everyone when it is up. So you should receive an email letting you know that it is on our YouTube channel. This next question is, how do you help someone who's been in grief for years over the death of a somewhat abusive parent and senses his presence, is comforted by that sense, and writes letters to him daily? Is this essentially their own path, and should we just support it?
There's a simple words that have deeper meaning. Is it working for them or not? Some people find a way for the both and. They acknowledge the pain, and yet they feel the love on both sides. And some people come to therapy rather with the either or. If he loved me, he wouldn't have hurt me. If he hurt me, he couldn't have loved me. And somehow this person is trying to hold both. And I think I would want to explore that with them. In what ways does that help her in her life? Comfort, but are there ways also in which it constrains her or gives her other difficulties or other sorrows? And how can we work with that so that we, it's because why is she coming for help? Or maybe she's not coming for help. I don't know. So do we have a last question maybe?
Well, we don't have a last question, and we don't have the time to talk about something that I would like to throw out for consideration that I was thinking about as you gave your presentation. And, that is for all the urban area youth who are experiencing loss daily. And it seems like much of their grief is disenfranchised, and just thinking about what needs to happen there, and also wondering if this cycle of violence is in part because we are not really looking at their grief. I mean, it's more that sense that this is how they live and this is what they're doing to themselves. And so it is disenfranchised, and, and it's racialized. Yes. And so, I was just curious as to, some of your thinking about that, particularly in Chicago, where, that's a daily occurrence, similar to here in Philadelphia. But yeah,
No, I have just a couple of minutes. Yes, yes to everything you said. It is complex, and I hope maybe there'll be a forum to grapple with that. How we could facilitate that better in communities and in the wider community and in the media and the social media, because that's where it needs to get validated and heard.
Mhm.
The media too quickly moves on. So, the day of an occurrence, the week of an occurrence, and then it's on to the next, news cycle and the next tragedy. And the people are left with it. Because University of Chicago is on the south side of Chicago, and I lived there for many years. A lot of the training and supervision that I did was helping families who had experienced these losses. And let me just mention just two. Well, I only have time for one. This was one where I was brought in as a consultant. A mother was being seen individually for her just inconsolable grief, inconsolable, many, many months after the death of the son. And he had been killed in it was a shooting thing and crossfire, and he got caught in it. And he managed to get home and died in his mother's arms. So, she's being seen. And I said, well, the husband was their only son. The son was about to graduate from high school, and he was going to go on to college. It was, all their hopes and dreams.
Mhm.
And she said, oh, well, my husband doesn't want therapy. He doesn't need therapy for him. He says he doesn't need therapy for himself. And he has to get up and go to work every day. And he doesn't get time off for that. He's just holding it together. So I was just consulting, and I said, well, does the husband, do you think he might come in for a few sessions just to support the work you're doing with his wife? And he said, well, he drives her to every session and he waits for her in the car. So I think he might. So sometimes, we may be able, because he had lost his son, and there was no space for it. And there was no place in his work life anywhere for him to be able. And, I think that's where people turn to alcohol. They turn to, a way to numb that pain when they don't have a way and a place to share it and to express it.
Yeah, and the larger problem of systemic racism and racism in general makes that very difficult,
Yes.
for people,
Yeah.
Well, this has been absolutely informative and thoughtful, and I mean, it's just great, and I hope more people will certainly look at it on the website, because on our YouTube channel, because it really is needed in therapy rooms across this nation and internationally as well, because we all have experienced the losses from the pandemic. I mean, just huge losses. So thank you so much for your work. I look forward to your book coming out. Let us know when it's out. And it was great seeing you again, Froma. So thank you so much.
Thank you very much.